He was injured in Derry, in a premature explosion of a grenade. That was a wound that troubled him greatly when he was interned in the Curragh. And his arrest and the time in the Curragh was important. And many of the events that sort of resonate through the late 60s really have their origin in 1957 to 1959 when the Curragh was operational once again on the De Valera. Now, some of those who arrested with him in Glencree in May 1957 were quite a group. There was 38 of them in all. It was a disaster for the Dublin sector IRA, and the vast bulk of the recruits in the Dublin Wicklow sector were rounded up on that occasion. The man in charge of that was the, let's just be kind, eccentric, he's still alive, so be careful, Bernard O'Riordan, of whom I've heard quite a few stories which are shocking indeed. Now, Costello must have encountered O'Riordan, and not simply in the Curragh training, but due to the fact that O'Riordan was the OC in Dunleary, and Bray at different times had come under, or come as an association with that part of County Dublin. Sean Garland, of course, Francis Rossa, who tells us he jettisoned his links with the Republican movement, certainly the IRA part of it, in 1960. Okay, Francis. Paddy O'Regan, who was recovering from being injured in the Brookford raid on the 1st of January 1957, including being shot in the back of the neck with a .302 rifle that travelled down the spine and out his back. Peter Pringle, another man with strong local connections at different times, who was arrested on a subsequent occasion. Phil O'Donoghue, names that are resident. On the 6th of May 1959, he was released from the Curragh. Now, at that stage, the IRA, as had been intended, had already begun to fracture, at least in terms of tendencies around Tony McGann, the very efficient, traditional-style chief of staff, and the element around Sean Cronin, which wavered, and particularly Charlie Murphy. The notion of Charlie Murphy, Sean Cronin, versus the old guard of Tony McGann, Paddy McLogan, and Thomas McCurtain. McCurtain very quickly removed himself from the equation. Costello would have heard a lot of internal debate. And even then there were issues such as abstentionism rearing its head as a central factor. Sinn Féin had 5 abstentionist TDs during the 50s campaign, which is quite an achievement, and numerous inroads into county councils. But leaving that aside, by the end of the campaign in February '62, Sinn Féin was in a very bad state of affairs. Wexford was riven with factionalism. All the TDs had been lost, and the head of Sinn Féin, of course, was Paddy McLogan. He was basically ousted instead of Thomas McGuire. And Colin Goulding came in instead of Rory O'Brien as chief of staff of the IRA. So you have a very significant change going on, which as I said, you reverberate through the 1960s. Now, just to step back for 1 second, the release of Seamus Costello as one of the last batches of people released from the Curragh, by the way, included Noel Kavanagh, who had been a very active Dubliner up in South Fermanagh in the early phases, and knows a very important, politically astute Irish Republican who later involved in Wolf Tone Society in some of the more progressive aspects of the very interesting and underrated Wolf Tone Society. Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain, happened to be in Belfast on the day of these releases. And he described those men as, quote, the hardcore of the illegal organisation. Well, that must have pleased them. I know certainly Noel Kavanagh would have worn that as a badge of honour to describe as the hardcore of the illegal organisation. Now, for Macmillan to be speaking as such, at a breakfast or a luncheon for Ulster Unionists is exactly what you could expect from someone like him. And this man is meant to be a progressive. He's meant to be a comparatively moderate figure. Well, suffice to say that campaign did bring home some hard truths, which is that it was possible to have enormous electoral support, but not sufficient active support for the armed campaign on the ground. And that if you did want to wage a guerrilla struggle by means of liberated zones, you must have a higher degree of support on the ground. There weren't enough safe houses, there wasn't enough transport, there weren't enough people providing intelligence for targeting, and there's many reasons for that. They don't concern us. But the point is, they did concern people like Seamus Costello, and this is exactly what they were debating during the campaign, and intensely from 1962 when you have the change of the leadership. It's not a coincidence that Seamus was one of the first Sinn Féin members to return to county councils, of course in his locality stronghold of Bray Urban District Council, and to do so with Joe Doyle. Joe Doyle is another figure who often doesn't get much of a mention, even though he's a very interesting Wicklow man, and I had the pleasure of interviewing his sister about him a number of years ago. From a very political family in those days, later stayed all the way in through the Workers' Party, and had Thomas McGill and Goulding give orations and eulogies for him on his death. Doyle had suffered a difficult and debilitating imprisonment, where he was got a life sentence in England. He was one of those sort of forgotten prisoners, and I believe he was the last man emancipated from England in the aftermath of the 50s term. So this is the company he was keeping, and it seems to me that wherever he was located within the Republican movement, he was always firmly to the fore of issues to do with debates of abstentionism, tactics in the armed struggle, and indeed tactics of political struggle on the ground, at which he excelled. It's very difficult to think of any other single member of Sinn Féin that made such an actual difference on the ground as Seamus Costello. And I'm not surprised at all that the successors in Irish Republican Socialist Party and others look to him as a prototype, as a template. And this is exactly why he was so feared by the establishment. Because what you're consistently seeing in terms of Costello's life is an attempt to achieve an efficient, impactful balance between radical politics in theory and radical politics in action. And he was someone who would have been looking for a socialist led Ireland in his lifetime, not to kick the touch the next generation. And of course, until the issue of the six counties is definitively resolved, it is going to echo and is going to destabilise the politics and the culture of this entire island, this entire country. Unfortunately, we know this. It always has. There's no reason to presume it will not continue to be so. And there's been enormous political developments in vis-a-vis the issue of local government in the north. But the substantive questions for the time being have been parked. And many people would like to see them being addressed in the near future, of which there is a good chance. And hopefully we'll see what happens. But if you have, as the IRA developed, as the Republican developed in the mid-1960s, a capacity to have very sophisticated politics, which they did, and the capacity for militant direct action, which they did, you're looking at quite a beast, in the best sense of the word, perhaps. I'm going to read some very brief extracts from what Costello wrote and was saying, but I think they're quite important. Now, in 1965, he spoke at a commemoration in Arklow, which is represented in this room. Arklow, as many will know, was the scene of the second most decisive battle of 1798, on the 9th of June 1798, a very important battle. And Costello knew all about that. And in reading his overall speech, it's quite clear that he's done his homework. And it's more than just a quick reading of P.F. Cavanagh's The Insurrection in Wexford. I now, of course, lost the bit I was going to read. But basically, I have to read almost any part of it. There's quite a lot to digest. I'll read this bit. Sinn Féin has planned a campaign of political action throughout the whole country, which will take the form of a militant programme of agitation to prevent the further takeover of the land, industry and trade of the country by foreign speculators, and to ensure that the resources of the nation are placed firmly in the hands of the people of the nation. Sinn Féin has also planned a national programme of political action to force the withdrawal of British troops and British administrative forces from the six-county area. And that is all left-leaning Republicans know is the only way these things can happen, the only way these things are likely to happen, which is that the issue of Connolly and Pearse must be resolved, and the balance between political assertion and armed action has to be fixed if it's going to be impactful, if it's going to actually work. Now, what you see here, in my opinion, is a very modern, progressive point. It does go back to Lawlerism, it does go back to Connolly. Of course it was. It's in that tradition. It is in the tradition of the men of no property. And it's interesting to note that the best-selling author of the biography of Wolfe Tone, Marion Elliott, OBE, has vehemently denied that Tone was talking about the land of the Swedes when he spoke of the men of no property. Well, a former member of the Official Republican Group from Belfast, Jim Smith, now a lecturer in history in Notre Dame, Indiana, deliberately called his book on the defenders of the Dun City United Irishmen, the men of no property, to reassert that he did. And of course he did. So we're looking here at someone who's definitely deeply engaged, is basically a street activist for the totality of his life. Now, by the mid-1960s, of course, he was a very senior figure, formally in the party and in the army, prepared from Sean Doyle. And to rise to become Adjutant General and Director of Operations and to have senior positions through the Sinn Féin annex as well is important. At Bogenstown, which, as many will realise, important policy strategic speeches tend to be given, not necessarily written by those who deliver them, but the speech that he gave in Bogenstown in 1966 raised an eyebrow. Now, this is the same year, of course, that he was primarily responsible for a riot by insisting that the blue flag of Ober Maher and Dutton Brigade was going to Glasnevin one way or another. So there was a lot of stuff going on. This is the year that the IRA itself was slightly embarrassed to have their moment of thunder eclipsed by former comrade Joe Crystal, who did the demolition job in Nelson's Pillar. And the attempt to have, I suppose, a spectacular by a barracks raid in Newry did not come off for reasons that I won't detain us with today, but suffice to say the security on the ground wasn't what it needed to be. So when Costello spoke, this is how it was reported. At 4:47 p.m., Seamus Costello, one hand in his pocket and one holding a sheet of papers, began his address. He spoke of the 6 counties, dependent on a regime backed by the British forces. This regime has perpetuated bigotry. And the 26 counties, the most that could be said is that religious discrimination is absent. Okay? He spoke of the sorry mess that has been made of the Irish economy and said the Irish people are not told that the profits of their labour is invested abroad by native and foreign capitalists. Well, that's how the Irish Times reported it. Here's another thing that was said in that speech. He actually cites Laura, he cites Mitchell, Pearce and Connolly. He moves on to talk about that continuum of 98, 48, 67, 1916, just locating those seismic events in the theories and practices of those left-of-centre thinkers. Therefore, to imagine that we can establish a republic solely by constitutional means is utter folly. The lesson of history shows that in the final analysis, the Robert Baron must be disestablished by the same methods that he used to enrich himself and retain his ill-gotten gains, namely force of arms. To this end, we must organise, train, and maintain a disciplined armed force which will always be available to strike at the opportune moment. That's what he actually said, right? A very muted version is given in the press account. Because they will lie to us. They always lie to us. And they will particularly lie when they're hearing a message like that from as gifted and as penetrating an orator as Seamus Costello. I've got my own sheet of papers here getting confused.